Hello hockey fans, Oddman Rush here and welcome back to another video. It's been a while since my video on the 1979 NHL Entry Draft was released, so it's time for us to revisit the history books once again and explore another notable draft from years past. However, instead of picking a great draft, let's flip the script once again and highlight another event that many teams wish they could forget. And what better one to pick than 1996? After all, given the number of first round draft picks that made a minimal impact in the league, and given the sizable group of prospects that failed to live up to the hype, there is a legitimate argument to be made that the 1996 draft is one of the worst events of the last few decades. So in today's video, join me as we explore why the 1996 NHL Entry Draft was a mess. Now, in order to examine just how awfully this draft panned out, let's look at all the first round selections that failed to reach their potential in the many years after the draft. And to do that, let's work our way from the latest selection of the round all the way to the very top of the draft order. Brace yourselves folks, this is gonna be a rough one. Kicking things off, we have the 26th overall pick by the Detroit Red Wings, Jesse Wallin. The first of many disappointing selections from this opening round, Jesse Wallin would end up playing just 49 NHL games over parts of 4 seasons, all with the Red Wings, scoring only 2 points during that span. Following his longest stint in the league during the 02-03 NHL season, Wallin would play a lone game in the minors the following year before retiring from the sport altogether at the age of 25. Despite his disappointing playing career in the show, Wallin has found plenty of success elsewhere in the game, as he has spent the last 2 decades serving as either a coach or a scout for various different teams, and he is currently working as a scout for the Detroit Red Wings, a role he has held for the last 4 seasons. It's great to see that Wallin remains with the organisation that drafted him, albeit in a slightly different role, you know. Next up, we have the 25th pick by the Colorado Avalanche, Peter Ratchuk. Another blue liner who didn't reach his potential, Peter Ratchuk played just 32 NHL games over parts of 2 seasons exclusively with the Florida Panthers, where he potted a goal and an assist for his efforts. After an 8-game stint with the Panthers during the 2001 season, the American defenseman would spend the rest of his career either down in the minors in the AHL or overseas in Europe, as he played 6 years in Germany's DEL and even won a championship with the Frankfurt Lions. Similarly to Wallin before him, Ratchuk has spent the last decade working in the front office instead, as he spent 8 years as a scout for the Winnipeg Jets before being promoted to their Director of Pro Scouting back in 2019, a role he continues to fill to this very day. I guess failed first round picks turn out to be pretty great scouts, right? Moving on to the 23rd pick by the Phoenix Coyotes, we have Craig Hillier. One of the most disappointing selections of this entire draft class, Craig Hillier would never suit up in a single NHL game, as the netminder would fail to earn even a lone start during his half-a-decade career as a pro hockey player. After playing for 9 different teams over his 5-year pro career, and after spending a whole season in the Netherlands, Hillier would retire from the sport shortly after the 03-04 season concluded. Though he would leave the game behind for over a decade, Hillier has returned in recent years, as he became the goaltending coach of the Dalhousie University during the 2018-19 season, a job he continues to serve 5 years later. What is it with all these 1996 draft busts earning coaching gigs in the 2 decades since? This really doesn't add up, does it? Shifting to the 22nd overall pick by the New York Rangers, we have Jeff Brown. Equally as disappointing as Hillier before him, Jeff Brown never made it to the show, as he failed to play a single NHL game during his career. Instead, the Canadian defenseman would spend much of his time in various leagues across North America, and he would even play 3 seasons in Great Britain too. Shout out to the Elite Ice Hockey League. After playing the 08-09 season with the MLH's Brantford Blast, and after scoring 23 points in 24 games for the team, Brown would hang up his skates and call it a career. And while he hasn't worked in the sport since, he did produce an 11-year career as a pro hockey player, which is significantly longer than some of the other players we've looked at so far, and you've kind of got to take the small victories with players like this, right? Next, we have the 19th pick by the Edmonton Oilers, Mathieu Descoteaux. Another selection that actually played in the NHL, Mathieu Descoteaux didn't stick around for very long though, as he ended up playing only 5 NHL games, all with the Montreal Canadiens during the 2001 NHL season, where he potted a goal and an assist in the process. Following his handful of games in the league, the Canadian defenseman would spend the next half a decade suiting up for various pro teams across the hockey world before returning to Quebec for the 06-07 season, where he joined the province's North American Hockey League, known as the LNAH. After spending 3 seasons in the LNAH, Descoteaux would retire from the sport at the conclusion of the 08-09 season. Now, while he hasn't worked in hockey in a professional capacity since then, just like Brown before him, Descoteaux produced an 11-year career in the sport, and considering that we're scraping the bottom of the barrel here, we'll take whatever we can get. Now we have the 18th pick by the Montreal Canadiens, Matt Higgins. Completely unrelated to longtime NHLer Chris Higgins, Matt didn't pan out nearly as well as his fellow namesake, as he played 52 NHL games over parts of 4 seasons, all with Montreal, where he scored a single goal and 3 points for his efforts. After a 6-game stint with the Habs during the 2001 NHL season, the Canadian forward would spend the next 2 years in the minors before embarking on a lengthy stint in Europe, as he played 6 seasons in Germany's DEL before moving to Slovenia for the 09-10 season. From there, Higgins would spend 2 years in the country before retiring from the sport at the conclusion of the 10-11 season. So thanks to his productive play across the pond, Higgins produced a 14-year career as a pro hockey player. Sure, he didn't clearly pan out for the Canadians, of course, but his career certainly could have gone worse for himself, all things considered, right? On to the 16th overall pick by the Tampa Bay Lightning, we have Mario Larocque. Owner of a handful of appearances in the show, Mario Larocque would suit up in just 5 NHL games, all with the Lightning during the 98-99 season, where he failed to register a single point during that span. Following his brief stint in the league, the Canadian defenseman would spend the next 16 years playing for a number of teams across the hockey world, including a variety of franchises in North America, as well as brief stints in Austria, Italy, and Great Britain too. After spending the 14-15 season with the ECHL Stockton Thunder, and after potting 13 points in 35 games for the team, Larocque would finally call it a day on his career, and though he would take a brief hiatus from the sport, he would return behind the bench, as he spent 5 seasons serving in various coaching roles for several different bantam teams across Quebec. So even though he produced one of the shorter NHL careers of this group, Larocque ended up having one of the longest pro careers out of anyone that we've mentioned. You can take the player out of the game, but you can't take the game out of the player, right guys? Shifting our attention to the 17th pick by the Washington Capitals, Yaroslav Svejkovsky. One of the more experienced NHL players in this group, Yaroslav Svejkovsky took to the ice in 113 NHL games over parts of 4 seasons, split between the Capitals and the Tampa Bay Lightning, scoring 23 goals and 42 points in the process. God, you know it's a tough group when 113 games and 42 points is seen as a beacon of light in comparison, right? After his final stint in the league during the 99-2000 season, the Czech forward would play a pair of games in the IHL during the following 2001 season, before retiring from the sport shortly after at just 24 years old. Despite this unceremonious end to his professional career, Svejkovsky has found new life in the front office, as he has spent the last 16 years serving in various different coaching roles for various different organisations, and he is currently employed as a skills coach for the AHL's Abbotsford Canucks, a role he has held for the last 2 seasons. Now sure, Svejkovsky did spend considerable time in the show, and he did reach triple digits in games played, but playing just 113 contests as the 17th highest pick of the draft class isn't exactly a successful selection, is it? Maybe compared to the rest of this group, but not to everybody else. Next up, we have the 12th overall pick by the Vancouver Canucks, Josh Holden. One of the more interesting pro careers in this group, Josh Holden would play 60 NHL games over parts of 6 seasons, split between the Canucks, the Carolina Hurricanes, and the Toronto Maple Leafs, notching 5 goals and 14 points for his efforts. After his final stint in the show during the 03-04 season, the Canadian forward would take his talents overseas and ply his trade in Europe, as he spent the following year in Finland before playing for several teams in Switzerland in the 3 seasons that followed. Speaking of Switzerland, Holden would join National League side EV Zug for the 08-09 season and would produce quite the tenure with the team. As he spent the next decade of his career with the organisation, he scored 392 points in 416 games with the team, and he last played for the side during the 17-18 season when he was 40 years old. In fact, Holden made such an impact for Zug that he would remain with the organisation after his retirement, as he was immediately hired as an assistant coach for the team, and he continues to serve in this role half a decade later. His NHL career clearly didn't pan out, but it's safe to say that Holden produced a very successful career in this sport. It's just a shame that it happened with Zug and not the Canucks, right? Now we have the 11th pick by the Phoenix Coyotes, Dan Vogt. Another selection who spent a few dozen games in the show, Dan Vogt would play 82 NHL games over parts of 3 seasons, split between the Coyotes and the Pittsburgh Penguins, where he potted 2 goals and 8 points in the process. Following a full season stint with the Penguins during the 03-04 season, the Canadian defenseman would spend the next 2 years with a pair of teams in the AHL before hanging up his skates at the conclusion of the 05-06 season. And while he produced a 9-year pro career, he doesn't appear to have worked in any professional capacity within the sport of hockey in the 2 decades since then. Not the most exciting career, both during and after his playing days, but Vogt did play over 80 games in the league and he spent an entire season on an NHL roster. There's plenty of picks from this draft class alone that wish they could say the same, you know? It's taken us a while, but we finally reached the top 10 of the draft order. And while the premier picks didn't have as many busts as the rest of the round, there were still several players who didn't pan out, and then some. First off, we have the 10th overall pick by the New Jersey Devils, Lance Ward. One of the more veteran NHLers compared to his contemporaries in this video, Lance Ward would play 209 games in the show over parts of 4 seasons, split between the Florida Panthers and the Mighty Ducks of Anaheim, scoring 4 goals and 16 points during that span. After last playing in the show during the 03-04 season, the Canadian defenseman would spend the following year in the minors before taking his talents to Europe, as he spent the next 5 years playing for a pair of teams across the pond. Though he would hang up his skates after the 10-11 season concluded, and though he would briefly work in coaching during the 18-19 season, Ward has returned to the ice during the current 22-23 season, as the 43-year-old scored 2 points in 2 games with the Red Deer Rustlers of the National Collegiate Hockey League. So not only did he play 200 games in the NHL and produce a 12-year pro hockey career, Ward has entered university and is getting an education too. It's never too late to go back to school, folks. Next up, we have the 8th overall pick by the Boston Bruins, Jonathan Aitken. Yet another Canadian defenseman who failed to reach the hype, Jonathan Aitken would end up playing only 44 NHL games over parts of 2 seasons split between the Bruins and the Chicago Blackhawks, where he potted a single assist during that span. Following a half-season stint with Chicago in 03-04, the Canadian blue liner would spend the next 2 years in the minors, play in Austria the following year, and join the Chinook Hockey League for the 07-08 season before calling it a day on his career. However, after a 7-year hiatus, Aitken would return to the Chinook League for the 15-16 season, and he has spent the last 8 years bouncing between playing and not playing for a pair of teams in a pair of leagues. While he would embark on a brief coaching career between 2017 and 2019, Aitken is currently playing for the Innisfail Eagles of the Chinook League during the current 22-23 season, where the 44-year-old has gone scoreless in 2 games this year. Though he seems to have found his place in the hockey world, and he is still going strong to this very day, playing less than 50 NHL games as the 8th overall pick of your draft class is a huge disappointment and then some. Penultimately, we have the 5th overall pick by the Dallas Stars, Rick Jackman. The most experienced NHLer in this video, Rick Jackman would suit up in 231 NHL games over parts of 7 seasons split between 6 different teams, where he scored 19 goals and 77 points in the process. Interestingly, Jackman is also the only member of this group to have lifted the Stanley Cup, as he won the 2007 championship as a member of the Anaheim Ducks. At least one player found some success, right guys? After his cup-winning run with Anaheim during the 06-07 season, the Canadian defenseman would leave the league behind and embark on quite the world tour, as he spent the next decade of his career playing for numerous teams across various different countries, including Austria, Sweden, Switzerland, Korea, and Japan, amongst several others. Following a pair of seasons in Scotland with the EIHL's Braehead clan, Jackman would retire from the sport at the conclusion of the 16-17 season, where he would spend 2 years coaching back in his homeland between 2017 and 2019. Now, while some of you might argue that Jackman doesn't deserve to be included here since he played over 230 NHL games and he even won a championship, it's worth mentioning that Jackman was the 5th highest selection of his entire age group. People expected him to be far more than a journeyman in the league and a depth piece on a cup-winning team, and to be honest, pretty understandably so. And finally, last and most definitely least, we have the 4th overall pick by the Washington Capitals, Alexander Volchkov. The most disappointing selection of this entire draft class by a pretty sizable margin. Alexander Volchkov would go on to play just 3 NHL games during his career, where he failed to register a single point during that span. After his brief trip to the show during the 1999-2000 season, the Russian forward would spend the rest of the year in the minors before heading back home, as he returned to Russia for the 2001 season. From there, Volchkov would spend the next 3 years in his homeland and spend 7 seasons in Belarus before moving to Kazakhstan midway through the 09-10 season. Following a 5-game stint in Kazakhstan during the 10-11 season, and having scored a single point during that span, Volchkov would finally hang up his skates and retire from the sport at the age of 33. And while he did win several accolades during his career, he hasn't worked professionally within the sport of hockey since. So the 4th overall draft pick, the 4th highest selection of his age group, who should star for his franchise for many years to come, ended up playing just 3 games in the NHL. If that doesn't prove just how dreadful this draft was, I don't know what will. Now, it's worth mentioning that we have only highlighted the picks that played less than 250 games over the course of their respective NHL careers, and we still ended up discussing 14 different players. In fact, of the 26 picks in the first round of the 1996 draft, 11 of them played less than 100 NHL games, 8 played less than 50 games, while 2 of them never played a single game in the National Hockey League. Whatever way you look at it, the first round of this draft was dreadful. That said, I should mention that the first round did feature some pretty great picks too. For example, Danny Briere and Marco Sturm were both taken towards the end of the first round, Dainius Zubrus and Derek Morris were both selected towards the middle of the round, while Ruslan Salai, Jean-Pierre Dumont and Chris Phillips were all taken in the top 10 of the draft order. In fact, 11 first-round picks played at least 500 NHL games, 8 played at least 750 games, while 3 played over 1,000 games. So the 1996 draft did feature some talented players, but they were few and far between. Now, while the first round left a lot to be desired, there were plenty of later round picks who went on to carve out long and successful careers in the National Hockey League. For example, Corey Sarich and Matt Cullen were some of the many long-time NHLers taken in the second round. Michael Roosevelt, Pavel Kubina and Zdeno Chara were the most notable names from the middle of the pack, while Thomas Kaberle, Willie Mitchell and Craig Adams were the most successful picks from the later rounds too. In fact, of the 215 selections between rounds 2 and 9 of the draft, 23 of them played at least 500 NHL games, 15 played at least 750 games, while 2 played over 1,500 games. Given that later round picks have to go above and beyond just to earn a brief glimpse in the NHL, and given that many of these selections panned out far better than many of their first round counterparts, they certainly could have done far worse for themselves if you ask me. So based on our findings in this video, I think we can all agree that the 1996 NHL Entry Draft was a mess. Sure, it featured several diamonds in the rough, and some players even produced Hall of Fame careers, but given that so many premier picks failed to reach even the lowest of expectations, and given that most of these selections couldn't even make a minimal impact in the show, there's no way that you can call this draft a success overall, especially compared to all the other events held before and in the many years since then. It may have had some good selections, and it certainly wasn't the worst event ever, but if any draft can be described as a disappointment, it's 1996. And on that note, I'm going to end today's video. That was why the 1996 NHL Entry Draft was a mess. What do you guys think about this draft or the selections that were made at the event? Do you agree that this draft was a mess, or do you think that it was better than I've given it credit for? Also, is there another draft you would like me to look at in a future video, whether it's an amazing one or a terrible one? Do let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear what you guys have to say. But thank you very much for watching, guys. I do hope you have enjoyed. Please feel free to like, subscribe, share, watch some of my other videos. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye. A big thank you to Bexy93, Burned Retinas, Drew Fawcett, Houston NG, Raquel and Worthless Pieces for helping support this video via Patreon. If you too want to help support the channel a little bit further and get a shout out at the end of every future video, make sure you head over to patreon.com/oddmanrush and become a patron today.